Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Ben. In the last video, we discussed metabolism, particularly as it pertains to your total daily energy expenditure, and we went over the four components you can see listed right here. If you're not familiar with these terms, then I suggest that you watch that video before this one, because in this video, we're going to take things a step further, and we're going to discuss how all of these components interact with the weight loss process and how weight loss impacts your metabolism as a whole. Since your resting metabolic rate is the greatest contributing factor to your total daily energy expenditure, we will begin by discussing this component. Now, as you lose weight, you will lose metabolically active tissue, and thus you should expect your resting metabolic rate to decrease. If you recall from the last video, each pound of fat contributes 2 calories per day, and each pound of muscle contributes 6 calories per day. Thus, as an example, if you were to lose 25 pounds total, 20 pounds of fat, and 5 pounds of muscle, this should decrease your resting metabolic rate by 70 calories. There have been many studies that evaluate this, and what many of them find is that the actual decrease is greater than what would be expected. Part of this may be due to artifact, just by not measuring all the changes in organ tissue size perfectly. Nonetheless, this effect has been fairly consistently seen, at least in many different studies, and has typically been termed adaptive thermogenesis, or a metabolic adaptation to the weight loss process. A very recent systematic review summarized much of this literature, and you can see the results on the screen. In this systematic review, the authors evaluated 33 different studies looking at different components of the total daily energy expenditure, and 23 of them did find an adaptive thermogenesis component with the resting metabolic rate. However, the authors do note that the higher quality studies did not find this to the same degree, or did not find this at all, and after a period of weight stabilization, which means that the participants lost weight and then remained at their new lower body weight for some period of time, this adaptive thermogenesis went away completely in many cases. And now I will show you a couple further studies that also illustrate these points. In this first study, the authors took a bunch of individuals with a starting BMI of 22 to 28, which means none of them were in the state of obesity, which is defined by a BMI of 30 and above, and they put all of them on a 25% caloric restricted diet for a time span of 2 years. They measured the resting metabolic rate before this began and 1 year into this process, and you can see on the screen a figure that shows the results. In this figure, each individual column corresponds to a different participant in the study. Each column has a darker bar, a white bar, and a black dot. The black dot shows the measured resting metabolic rate 1 year into the dieting process, relative to the resting metabolic rate before the dieting process began. The darker bar shows what degree of this is expected from the change in organ tissue that was measured during the study. The white bar shows the adaptive thermogenesis component. You can see most people did have a decrease in their metabolism that had adaptive thermogenesis contribute to it, but not everyone did. A main takeaway of this particular figure is the large amount of individual variability. Some people had a decrease in their resting metabolic rate of around 300 calories, some people actually had an increase to some degree, and adaptive thermogenesis varied widely between different people. To be crystal clear, this individual variability is very important. Some studies may not find much of an effect overall on average, but for specific individuals, the actual contribution of adaptive thermogenesis may be very large. This is always something you need to consider when looking at the averages reported in studies. They may not capture the individual variability. Anyways, moving on to the final study we will look at for the resting metabolic rate, this study specifically examines the impact of weight stabilization after weight loss. In this study, they took a bunch of individuals and put them on a diet for 9 weeks. Then they put them on a weight stabilization diet to maintain their new lower body weight for 4 weeks, and for a subset of individuals, they continued a weight stabilization diet for up to 1 year, and they measured the resting metabolic rate at each of these time points, and you can see their results on the screen. The first 3 rows of this table show the body weight, fat mass, and fat-free mass respectively. The participants lost a lot of weight the first 9 weeks, maintained their weight loss over the next 4 weeks, and then experienced a small amount of weight regain by the 1 year time point. The fourth row shows the measured resting metabolic rate, while the fifth row shows the predicted resting metabolic rate based on changes in organ tissue size. The last row shows the actual adaptive thermogenesis, calculated by subtracting the prior two rows. You can see that at the 9-week time point, after the weight loss was complete, the adaptive thermogenesis was 107 calories per day on average between all of the participants. By week 13, after 4 weeks of weight stabilization, this had been cut roughly in half. And by the 1-year time point, after a relatively small amount of weight regain, this had dissipated pretty much completely. And thus, this study provides evidence that as time goes on and you maintain a new lower body weight, the adaptive thermogenesis component will go away and become completely negligible. To conclude this section, as you lose weight, your resting metabolic rate will decrease because you are losing metabolically active tissue. For many individuals, there will be an additional decrease due to adaptive thermogenesis. However, this varies widely between people, and it is very difficult to predict to what degree this will affect any specific person. On the bright side, after you are done losing weight and you are maintaining your new lower body weight, this adaptive thermogenesis will pretty much go away. And therefore, at least when looking at this one specific aspect of weight loss maintenance, it will become easier to maintain your new lower body weight. And now that we are done discussing the resting metabolic rate, we can move on to the next component of your total daily energy expenditure, which is the thermic effect of feeding. The thermic effect of feeding is thankfully much easier and simpler to discuss, because if you recall, this only describes the amount of calories your body has to use to digest and process the nutrients you consume. And on average, this will be roughly 10% of your total daily caloric intake. Therefore, as an example, if you were to decrease your caloric intake from 2,500 calories a day to 2,000 calories a day, this will yield a net caloric decrease by roughly 500 calories a day. And 10% of this would be 50 calories. And thus, your overall metabolism will decrease by roughly 50 calories per day. And that's all we have to consider for the thermic effect of feeding. And therefore, we can move right on to the next component of your total daily energy expenditure, which is your exercise activity thermogenesis. If you recall, your exercise activity thermogenesis describes how many calories your body uses for planned physical activity, such as getting up and going for a 30-minute jog. When you lose weight, because you have less mass to move, your caloric expenditure will decrease for the same amount of exercise. This is fairly obvious, but there's actually a second component that you need to consider, and that is your skeletal muscle efficiency. This describes how many calories your muscles need to use to perform a given amount of work. And when this decreases, that is a good thing for weight loss purposes, because that would mean that your muscles need to use more calories for the same amount of exercise. There are a handful of small studies that have evaluated how this changes with weight loss. What they typically find is that as you lose weight, your skeletal muscle efficiency will increase with low-intensity aerobic exercise. This is unfortunate for weight loss purposes, but it is what it is. However, for higher intensity aerobic exercise, there doesn't seem to be much of a change in skeletal muscle efficiency, and one small study a few years ago demonstrated that with low-intensity resistance training, you can actually reverse some of this change in your skeletal muscle efficiency, which would be a good thing for the purposes of losing more weight. Now, there's only a handful of small studies, as I said, so we actually need more data to be able to say conclusively how this changes with different types of exercise, different durations, and different intensities. So it is very difficult to predict for any given individual to what degree this will impact their weight loss journey. Nonetheless, you can generally expect that as you lose weight and as you increase your overall fitness, you are going to burn fewer calories for the same amount of exercise. And now that we've discussed all of that, we can move on to the next component of your total daily energy expenditure, which is your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. If you recall, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis describes all of the calories your body burns with unplanned physical activity, such as standing up and walking around. And there have been many studies over the years that have evaluated how this changes with dieting and exercise interventions. And these were recently summarized in a systematic review, which you can see on the screen. In this review, the authors looked at 36 different articles, and most of them found that there was no change in the non-exercise activity thermogenesis with these interventions. However, some of them did have a change, and these ones typically were associated with larger amounts of weight loss. Thus, it seems that with small amounts of weight loss, there isn't much of a change, but as you lose greater amounts of weight, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis will decrease to a larger degree. However, the authors did note that many of these studies were underpowered or simply too small to find very significant effects. And therefore, as time goes on and we accumulate more research, we might find that there is a larger impact of this than we previously thought, and that this does play a bigger role in the changes in your metabolism as you lose weight. I want to conclude this discussion by going through an example that illustrates how all of these various aspects impact the weight loss process. You can see the math on the right, but it is generally estimated that roughly 3,500 calories per day make up 1 pound of fat. Because there are 7 days in a week, that would mean that you need to eat at a 500 calorie deficit every single day to lose 1 pound of fat per week. However, after everything we've talked about in this video, you probably realize that this is not true, because when you start eating at a caloric deficit, you might experience some of that adaptive thermogenesis. So perhaps that will decrease your metabolism by roughly 150 calories per day. You will have a decrease in your thermic effect of feeding, and if you're at a 500 calorie deficit, that will decrease your metabolism by roughly 50 calories per day. If you are performing regular exercise, but you do not increase your exercise activity, then if your skeletal muscle efficiency increases, you'll have a further decrease in your caloric expenditure, and as time goes on and you lose more weight, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis may decrease as well. If you don't perform additional amounts of exercise or physical activity to counteract all of this, your overall caloric deficit will no longer be 500 calories a day, but rather it might be only, say, 250 calories per day. And if that's the case, it may actually take you twice as long to lose 1 pound of fat. Thus, all of these metabolic adaptations that occur with the weight loss process will generally slow down the degree of weight loss as time goes on. It may be a bit depressing to realize it can take longer to lose weight than you would otherwise expect. On the bright side, with a better understanding of what happens in your body during the weight loss process, you are in a better position to avoid falling for misinformation and scams, and you are in a much better position to more effectively track your progress and make adjustments as indicated. And in future videos, I will continue providing you information so that you can do just that. I'll see you then.